Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast for EASC 160 Spring 2026. I'm Noah, and I'm here today with.
Samantha,
And Vangelis.
We will be exploring early 20th century Chinese cinema and how it reflected and shaped ideas about feminism, politics, and social change.
thank you. Just some historical context. The early 1900s in China were a time of major transformation. There was first the fall of the Qing dynasty, and then, of course, the rise of new political movements and events like the May 4th and New Culture movements. People began to question their own traditional values and push for modernization. These shifts happened beyond politics and into art, literature, and especially film.
Cinema, in ways, became an important space where these new ideas could be expressed. Filmmakers used to explore themes like nationalism, class struggle, and gender roles. Women, in particular, became central figures in these stories and often represented both the possibilities and the limitations of a changing society.
In today's discussion, we will look at how women were portrayed in early Chinese films, the contradictions between these portrayals, and how broader political movements, especially communism, shaped the development of feminism during this period.
I would like to start by looking at how women were represented in early Chinese cinema and what exactly that reveals about how feminism was at the time. Many films that were made in the early 1900s portrayed women as strong, independent figures who fought against and attempted to challenge the restrictions of the feudal patriarchal society that they were placed in. These portrayals at the time did align with the emerging feminism movements within China, especially during the 1920s as new political ideologies were forming due to events such as the May 4th and New Culture movements. Scholars such as Maureen Soler Jorge, in his article Impacts of Feminism on Mainland Chinese Cinema, Gender, Class, and Women's Representations, argue that cinema at the time did reflect these broader social changes, depicting women who resisted traditional roles and sought greater autonomy. Maureen Soler Jorge, in his writing, covers how women in early films symbolized resistance to Confucian patriarchy and the old China social order. Their roles aligned with the emerging political movements that prompted equality and modernization. In addition to women being symbols of change, he also covers how early Chinese cinema highlighted how women were active contributors to society, reinforcing ideas of them being model citizens. Although these films did present forms of feminist imagery, it unfortunately did not demonstrate full independence. Feminism existed, but was controlled and shaped by state and social expectations. While doing some research on this, I came across Fei Mu's film, Spring in a Small Town. The 1948 film portrayed the patriarchal household that many women were subjected to. However, the plot of this film challenges these set expectations when the wife breaks these barriers. She attempts to find love elsewhere and attempts to escape these challenging circumstances that were commonly experienced among other women in the early 20th century China. Films such as this illustrate the emotional depth and social struggles of women while simultaneously critiquing gender inequality. Compared to Western cinema at the time, these portrayals were relatively progressive, offering early examples of female-centered narratives that questioned societal norms. One of the course readings that stood out to me the most when researching this topic was Phyllis Wemhuer's New Democracy and the Making of New China. Wemhuer directly connects this idea of women being model citizens by their participation in labor, family reform, and public life. Additionally, he explores how feminism existed during the early 20th century but was controlled and shaped by political and social expectations. He goes into the idea of new democracy and shows how gender equality was promoted, but it was within a framework designed to support the state's goals. While these films presented new possibilities for women, they were still shaped by the cultural and political limitations of their time. Even progressive portrayals often existed within systems that had not fully embraced gender equality.
Like Samantha mentioned, before during this time, the majority of women in leading roles often engaged with so socio-political issues. Compared to the earlier forms of representations, this shift suggested a move toward greater importance and significance for women in media. While women were visible on screen, this did not necessarily transfer into a genuine representation of independence. There's this book called Women Through the Lens, Gender and Nation in a Century of Chinese Cinema, written by Shuqin Xiu in 2003. And it argues that female character in Chinese cinema were often granted privileged visibility, meaning that women were central to the narratives, but not fully developed as independent subjects. Instead, they were frequently used as symbolic figures representing broader themes, such as a national identity and social transformation. The movie New Woman, directed by Sei Shu-sheng, follows an educated and independent woman who attempts to build her modern life through writing and having a proper job. At first, she embodies the idea of the new woman, representing the progression of society. However, as the story develops, she faces social pressures, exploitation, and the movie ends with a tragic outcome. Rather than being able to achieve independence, the story highlights the limits placed in a rapidly modernizing society. It's made this way so that the film can demonstrate how early Chinese cinema could represent modern female characters while still reinforcing the restrictions that they had during those times. In class, we also had this reading by Wang Zheng called Call Me King Yang, but not Funu. King Yang means revolutionary youth, and Funu means woman. What this is trying to say is that even women were encouraged to identify as a revolutionary youth rather than a woman, but they were made highly visible within national ideological narratives. This is also supported by Lakwan Pang, who is a renowned scholar in modern Chinese film, and she argues that even though during the time Chinese cinema aimed to promote social progress, it was still shaped by strong political constraints. Films associated with the left-wing cinema movement often used female characters to communicate broader messages about society, national development, and class, which led to women not always being portrayed as fully independent individuals in films.
Now, leading into the mid 1900s, Chinese feminism was closely linked to political movements and broader efforts towards social change. This was most bluntly evident during the late Qing reforms and the rise of revolutionary nationalism. Feminist thinkers such as Ding Ling linked women's liberation to the survival and modernization of the nation. They argued that oppressive traditions like foot binding and the limited access to education that women received weakened China in the face of foreign imperialism. Ding Ling was among the most influential feminist writers of the early 1900s. She explored the intricacies of women's inner lives, sexuality, frustration, and the social constraints that went along with them. Her most famous work, Miss Sophia's Diary, which was released in 1927, was one of the first pieces of literature that allowed a woman to be a protagonist with an opinion. Ka Wong, in his article about the book, Modernity, Sexuality, and Colonial Fantasy in Ding Ling's Miss Sophia's Diary, mentions how Sophia was allowed to have inconsistencies and be depicted as a real person, flaws and all. She openly described her attraction to men and elaborated on how she wanted intimacy with men, breaking the typical expectation that women were supposed to be completely modest. This just shows how strongly Ding Ling challenged many stereotypes about women, helping to normalize a fuller picture of women in literature. She later aligned herself with the Communist Party of China, but recognized the inequality presented to women within that system. Liu Jun also wrote about this in his 1923 story, What Happens After Nora Leaves Home, where he tackles the consequences of a woman emancipating herself from the patriarchal society of the time. When communism entered the Chinese political sphere in the 1940s, feminism was more so separate from the broader landscape of Chinese culture. Women were definitely fighting for rights, but a more patriarchal society was in control of the average citizen. Communism changed this significantly. Communists attributed women's oppression to the class society that was ruling culture at that point. They believed that the existence of private property prevented women from equalizing with their male counterparts, resulting in a lack of equality. This presents a fundamental difference between liberal feminism, which focused on legal equality and individual rights, rather than a collective shift in mindset that would lead to equality. When Zhang discusses this in his book Communism and Gender in China, how the Maoist era of communism was fairly progressive in terms of women's rights, with many tangible and structural changes being implemented in law to secure equality. These changes include the banning of arranged marriages, child marriages, and concubines, while securing the right of divorce by mutual consent, all of which are combined in the 1950 New Marriage Law. This law heavily promoted the idea that women deserve equal status within the family, rather than the prior patriarchal belief that women should be subservient to the man of the family. Women were also heavily encouraged to join the workforce in order to preserve the amount of resources required in a communist society. This is best exemplified by the popular slogan, Women hold up half the sky, representing the desire by the Communist Party for women to pick up half the weight when it comes to labor. This included a rush of women entering farmhand, factory worker, and even political roles that were previously foreign to them. Communism also sought to expand women's rights to education. This included a focus on literacy and schooling, which primarily benefited rural women, as they had previously been completely excluded from the need to develop basic literacy skills. This advancement in women's literacy put them on more equal footing with their male counterparts, leading to greater participation by women in political and community life. This feminism, although a very large jump for China, was still burdened by being state sponsored. This oversight by the government dissuaded independent feminist leaders from organizing and discussing their own, potentially more radical ideas. This led to a feminism that first aligned with the party's goals, primarily focusing on the class struggle. Feminism in China during the first half of the 20th century was closely linked with the communist movement of the time and to the broader cultural movement promoting equality for all.
To wrap up, early Chinese cinema gives us a unique perspective on a society and transition. Film is able to communicate the ideas about feminism, class, and national identity while also debating and reshaping them.
As we discussed, women in these films were often portrayed as strong and progressive figures, symbolizing change and resistance to traditional norms. Simultaneously, their roles were frequently limited by political ideologies and social expectations, showing true independence was still out of reach.
We also saw how feminism in China was deeply connected to a larger political movement, especially communism, which brought real structural changes for women while still maintaining control over how feminism was expressed.
Overall, early Chinese cinema highlights both progress and contradiction. It demonstrates how far ideas about gender equality have come, while also reminding us of the challenges that remained. By looking back at these films alongside these movements, we can gain a better understanding of how media can influence social change and how those conversations still continue today. Thank you for listening to our EASC 160 Spring 2026 podcast.